along the Atlantic coasts of northern Europe, are the last survivors of an ancient group of languages, still clinging to life despite 2,000 years of decline. Today there are likely less than 1 million people who regularly use the Celtic languages, and some appear unfortunately to be deeply endangered, with limited language transmission to younger generations and limited community use. It might be surprising then that this small group of languages, now only clinging to life, once dominated much of Europe, stretching from Ireland all the way to Turkey and from Portugal to Ukraine. During the pre-Roman European Iron Age, when the Celts reached their maximum extent, it would have been hard to imagine that one day this family would be reduced to the remnant that it is today. As the Roman Empire swept through Europe, the Celtic languages declined. Elites switched to using Latin or Greek, and gradually the more prestigious Latin-based languages came to be dominant in much of the previously Celtic-speaking regions. Today there is only one Celtic language left in continental Europe, the Breton language, spoken in the northwest of modern-day France. But this language did not originate in continental Europe. It originated in Britain, hence the name Breton, and was only brought to modern-day France in late antiquity. This brings us to our question for today. Where was the last continental Celtic language spoken? Now, before we get into this, there are various different potentially competing models for the genetic classification of Celtic languages. We're not going to get too into that today. Instead, we're simply going to define continental Celtic as the Celtic languages that do not have their origin in Britain or Ireland. The continental Celtic languages entered their terminal decline during late antiquity and possibly the early Middle Ages, a time where sources are limited and there are plenty of places for a language to hide. One might wonder, what languages could be hidden for a historian looking at the world today if they only had sources for our world as limited as the sources we have for the early Middle Ages? Would they still be aware that the Celtic languages are still spoken on the fringes of Britain, Ireland and France? Perhaps not. The problem is that languages rarely leave a neat death certificate. A language can disappear from inscriptions, documents and elite culture while still surviving in villages, families, or in this case, particularly isolated mountain communities. And indeed, part of the problem is that as a language becomes rarer and rarer, the less likely it is to appear in our sources, despite potentially still surviving in small communities. With this in mind, let's examine our possible candidates for the last holdouts of the continental Celtic languages. I'll start with some interesting cases that are fairly unlikely, follow with the most likely candidates, and finish off with a couple of interesting but unlikely wildcards. Our first candidate comes from Noricum. The language we refer to as Noric is mainly only known from two inscriptions, one found in Austria and the other in Slovenia. Both of these inscriptions appear to date from a period between the 2nd to the 3rd centuries AD, which is actually pretty late for Celtic inscriptional evidence found anywhere on the European continent. Celtic-speaking populations likely existed in this region for an exceptionally long time before we have inscriptional evidence, at least as far back as the Hallstatt period of the Late Bronze Age. Just as we can be pretty certain that these inscriptions do not represent the first time that a Celtic language was spoken in the Eastern Alps, we can be pretty sure that they don't represent the last time either. But exactly when the language died out is unclear. The default answer would probably be sometime in late antiquity, perhaps the 4th, perhaps the 5th century AD, but with very little evidence to provide any more specifics. While I was researching this, I found a 2003 paper titled Slovene from a Typological Perspective, Inherent and Contact-Induced Developments, with particular attention to Celtic, written by Jadranka Grodanovic. While this paper represents a minority, and as far as I can tell, pretty controversial position, if the paper's conclusions are accurate, it would mean the continuity of Celtic-speaking populations in the Eastern Alps until at least the 9th century AD, when it could have influenced the modern-day Slovene language, making it a viable candidate for the region where continental Celtic was last spoken. While this paper represents a minority, and as far as I can tell, pretty controversial perspective, If this paper's conclusions are accurate, it would mean the continuity of a Celtic-speaking population in the Eastern Alps until at least the 9th century AD, making it a viable candidate for the region where a continental Celtic language was last spoken. And indeed, if it did last until the 9th century AD, it would almost certainly be the region where continental Celtic was last spoken. Unfortunately, though, the evidence for this region is just too limited. The last time a Celtic language was spoken in the region could have been as early as the 4th century AD as Romanisation accelerated. Alternatively, it could have continued being spoken long into the early Middle Ages, and we simply do not have evidence either way. Our next location is the Balkans. Starting in the 4th century BC, Celtic-speaking groups began to migrate into the Balkans. For centuries afterwards, the Celtic languages were significant within the region, alongside Thracian, Dacian, Illyrian, Greek, Latin, and other languages. Our evidence for these languages, unfortunately, is highly limited, especially after the Celts within the region cease operating as independent political entities and become integrated into the Roman Empire. We have some evidence for continuing Celtic naming practices in the Balkans into the 3rd century AD, such as that of a man named Marcus Aurelius Cutia, living in modern-day Belgrade. Although I should say my source for that, Nadezhda Garilovich, argues that we shouldn't read too into Celtic names and imply a necessarily continued Celtic linguistic presence in the region by the 3rd century AD. Where I figured we might get evidence for a later survival of the Celtic languages in the Balkans is if we have any unique Celtic loans into the South Slavic languages. The Slavic languages didn't arrive in the Balkans until around about the 6th century AD, and so any Celtic loans would indicate a potential survival of the Celtic languages until at least that time. Unfortunately, there seems to be minimal evidence of direct Celtic influence on the Balkan Slavic languages, and what borrowings there might have been seem to come through intermediary languages, such as Illyrian, Dacian, or most prominently Latin. There also isn't a whole lot of evidence for Celtic influence on Romanian or other Balkan Romance languages either, although there is some for Albanian, a language that has much older roots in the region than the Slavic or Latin languages do. Realistically, I think we can say that a serious presence of the Celtic languages in the Balkans likely ended between the 2nd century AD and the 6th century AD. But of course, it is entirely possible that isolated communities persisted longer. This brings us on to Iberia. Celtic languages were spoken in Iberia for hundreds of years, prior to the Roman conquest in the aftermath of the Second Punic War. Iberia came under heavy Roman influence, with relatively early adoption of Latin among the general population compared to other parts of the Roman West. While we need to be careful, it appears that our last Celtic inscriptions from Iberia that we can confidently date originate from around the 1st century AD, with some evidence of Celtic elements in Latin inscriptions continuing until the 2nd or perhaps the 3rd century AD. As with the Balkans, Celtic names and isolated Celtic linguistic elements do not automatically prove a living Celtic language. People can preserve older names long after a language itself has disappeared. For instance, a modern person in a country that traditionally speaks a Celtic language, who might be named Cameron or Fiona or Niamh or Owen, does not necessarily speak a Celtic language themselves. There may be some inscriptional evidence for the Lusitanian and Galatian languages that pushes a little bit further, maybe into about the 3rd century AD. But while Galatian probably was Celtic, although that itself can be debated, Lusitanian was probably not. Most likely Lusitanian represents a 3rd branch of Western Indo-European, in addition to the Italic and the Celtic languages. Although it is possible that Lusitanian could be a Celtic language that simply split off from an earlier form of Celtic. Perhaps we could call it a para-Celtic language. By the 4th century, continued Celtic speech in Iberia becomes hard to justify. We lose meaningful evidence for Celtic names, and later Ibero-Romance does not seem to have picked up a new layer of Celtic loans from a surviving speech community. By contrast, later Iberian languages show influence from the languages we know were present, such as Basque, Arabic, and the Germanic languages, and not from the Celtic languages. As a result, it seems that we can reasonably conclude that the Celtic languages of Iberia lasted until somewhere between the 1st and the 4th centuries AD. This takes us to a region that I'm going to call North Central Europe. While we might not associate them with the region, the Celts were a significant presence in northern Central Europe since at least the time of the Latin expansion around the 4th century BC. This presence stretched from eastern Germany to Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, and all the way through to modern-day western Ukraine. There are possible Celtic traces in what is referred to as the Pravorsky culture, and in groups like the Lugi, while the Boii of modern Czechia were also quite clearly Celtic. This area became increasingly influenced by Germanic cultures over the course of antiquity. This does not mean that the Celtic languages disappeared overnight. These societies that we refer to as Germanic societies were probably not perfectly monolingual or monoethnic, and older Celtic-speaking groups were likely absorbed into these Germanic-speaking communities. By the migration period, though, peoples connected with this wider region, such as the Marcomanni, the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Burgundians, show very little evidence of any continuing Celtic language. Exactly how long a Celtic linguistic presence lasted in this region is hard to tell. We don't have any good inscriptional evidence, and our evidence from loans into other languages is very hard to interpret due to overlapping zones of influence and long possible contact periods. And of course, our historical sources are far more limited for this region than they are for areas within the Roman Empire. It is of course possible that hidden by our deeply incomplete records, some remote communities hidden deep in maybe the Slovak or the Ukrainian Carpathians could have continued speaking a Celtic language long after we lose evidence for the Celtic languages in this region. But currently it seems unlikely that the Celtic language in this region lasted much beyond the 3rd century AD. This brings us on to the first of our two most likely candidates, Turkey. The Galatian region of western Turkey, centred on the modern Turkish capital of Ankara, represents the furthest easternmost point of Celtic expansion during the pre-Roman Iron Age, reached by the Celts in the 3rd century BC during the chaos of the Wars of the Diadochi. For hundreds of years, Celtic tribes inhabited central Anatolia and continued to be a significant presence in the region long after they were integrated into the Roman Empire at the end of the 1st century BC. We get clear historical mentions of a continued Celtic presence in Galatia, continuing much later than in many other parts of the empire, including by Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century AD and from St. Jerome in the 4th century, suggesting the continued presence of Galatian as a community language, even as it becomes clear that Greek has already become influential and to an extent dominant within the region. It is around the 4th century AD, the same time as our reference from St. Jerome, that we get the last inscriptional evidence of Celtic continuity in this region from personal names. The key source, however, comes from the 6th century. In Cyril of Scythopolis, Life of Euthymus, a monk is said to be possessed by demons, and he is described as being unable to speak any language except for his native Galatian. This is probably the last clear attestation in any source of any continental Celtic language. This source is particularly relevant because Galatian in this context is much less ambiguous than Gallic or similar terms in Gaul. A reference to a Gallic language might mean a local Latin variety, but the 6th century AD reference to Galatian in Anatolia is very likely referring to the Celtic language of the Galatians. This does not mean that Galatian was healthy by this point in the 6th century AD. Greek was dominant, and the lack of later name evidence suggests that this language was probably already in severe decline. It may have survived Cyril's account, since the last mention of a language is very rarely the final moment that anybody spoke it, but we do not know for how long. Most likely, the language was already in very severe decline, and it probably did not last very long beyond the 6th century. But this is based on speculation. It could have, of course, survived for hundreds of more years in isolated communities. There are speculative and non-peer-reviewed attempts to connect words in Turkish to Galician, which would imply survival until at least the arrival of Turkish-speaking populations in Anatolia in around the 11th century AD. But these proposals are not widely accepted, and it appears likely that the Celtic languages of Anatolia likely declined sometime within the early Middle Ages. This brings us to probably our best candidate for the actual late survival of a continental Celtic language: Gaul. Even if Celtic languages likely originated further east, Gaul became the heartland of continental Celtic speech for much of antiquity. The Gaulish language clearly survived long after the Roman conquest, with inscriptional evidence continuing until around the 4th century AD. Clearly, Celtic personal names continue for around another century, with some evidence for continued bilingualism even contained within these names. For instance, from around about the year 400, we have record of a woman named Artula, with a daughter named Ursula. The mother and the daughter share a name with the same meaning, that of a little female bear. But the mother's name is Gaulish, while the daughter's name is Latin. This does not prove that the family still spoke Gaulish at home, but it does suggest more than simply fossilized names. Someone still understood the relationship between the Gaulish and the Latin forms here. This same inscription also uses the Celtic word mater, rather than the Latin mater, to refer to the mother here, making it one of the latest possible inscriptions with meaningful Gaulish language. Once again, we also have the reference from Jerome towards the end of the 4th century, where he suggests that the Treveri tribe of the Belgae people were still speaking a Celtic language, and one that he says to be similar to the language spoken in Galatia in Turkey. Around the same time as that last possible Gaulish inscription, Germanic tribes, particularly the Alemanni, begin to cross the Rhine in large numbers and settle in what is today's Switzerland. And while this is not uncontested, it does appear that the Alemannic dialects of what we would now call Swiss German were influenced by Gaulish in a distinct way. While this could represent transmission via local Latin dialects, the German scholar Bodo Müller has presented at least some evidence that these influences were direct, indicating a continued speaking of the Gaulish language in what is now Switzerland until at least the 5th century AD, in a significant enough way that it was able to influence modern-day Swiss German, at least to a limited extent. Certainly by the 5th century, while Gaulish was likely still present in the region, it does seem to have been in decline. The question is, how long did it last after the 5th century? There are scattered references to what might be Gaulish over the next couple of centuries, including the clearest reference by Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century. However, by that point, the references to what Gregory of Tours calls Vasso-Galatia might be referring to the Gaulish language itself, but might also be referring to local Romance dialects, particularly those influenced by Gaulish, rather than being a clear reference to Gaulish itself. Older scholars sometimes allowed for Gaulish survival as late as the 8th, 9th, or even 10th centuries AD. Modern scholarship, though, is usually a bit more cautious. The safest view is that clear evidence fades from around the 6th century AD, although isolated communities may have survived a little bit longer. The thing is, our sources from early medieval Gaul are particularly poor, and this allows for many places where an isolated language might be able to hide. After the Carolingian Renaissance begins, towards the end of the 8th century AD, the quantity and quality of our sources begins to increase again. And after this point, we would really expect to be able to identify any widespread Gaulish presence from sources such as hagiographies or annals. This means that we can realistically narrow the point where Gaulish ceased to be spoken to likely between the 6th and the 8th centuries AD. This brings us on to the first of our two wildcard candidates, Britain. This is meant to be an explanation that is potentially interesting, but I need to stress is very much outside of where mainstream scholarship would be looking. At first, Britain seems to defeat the purpose of this exercise a little bit, as we are defining continental languages as those that did not develop in Britain or Ireland. Yet there are some exceptions here that are worth mentioning. Several Celtic groups moved from the European continent to Britain towards the end of the pre-Roman period. The best known example is the Parisii of Yorkshire, who may have had links to the Parisii of northern Gaul. There was also Belgic influence across southern Britain, especially with the Atrebates and similar small cross-channel movements connected with groups that fled Gaul during Caesar's Gallic Wars. Although this was likely an elite migration of a few refugees fleeing Roman retaliation. So in theory, a continental Celtic language could have crossed into Britain and survived there for some time. But this is unlikely to matter for our question. These groups were probably too small, too integrated, and too surrounded by Brittonic and later Latin-speaking populations to preserve a separate continental Celtic language for centuries, although the possibility is of course interesting. Lastly, we have Brittany. The Breton language that survives to us today is a Brittonic language, most closely related to Welsh and Cornish, and originating in a migration from Britain to Brittany during the early Middle Ages. Brittany is a potential candidate for one of the last surviving regions of Gaulish, although it doesn't seem to be quite as good a candidate for some other regions, such as Switzerland. However, if we were to assume for a moment, possibly against better evidence, that there remained a Celtic presence in Brittany during the Breton migrations, how would these two groups have interacted? Our real problem here is the same one that I referenced at the start. We don't have a clear understanding of the internal workings of the Celtic family tree. It is possible that the insular Celtic languages, that being the Brittonic and the Gaelic languages, do themselves form a true clade distinct from the other Celtic languages. But it is also possible that the Brittonic languages are themselves more similar to Gaulish, or at least the northern dialects of Gaulish, than they are to languages like Irish, Manx and Scots Gaelic. This raises an interesting possibility. Was Breton purely a British import, or was it partially shaped by surviving Gaulish? In theory, some blending is possible, especially if Northern Gaulish was relatively close to Brittonic. However, the evidence for this is weak. Breton looks overwhelmingly like a descendant of Common Brittonic, not a continuation of Gaulish, although there may have been some local influence, but probably not enough to make Breton a true continental Celtic survival, hidden by British influence. So Brittany is an interesting wildcard, but it is not a strong candidate. So to summarise, where was continental Celtic last spoken? If we are looking for the last place that we have a firm attestation of a continental Celtic language, that would be Galatia in modern-day Turkey in the 6th century AD. But if we were looking for the last place where anybody spoke a continental Celtic language, we have a number of possibilities, all with the same fundamental problem, that problem being a simple lack of evidence. We have many plausible candidates where Celtic languages could have persisted into late antiquity or the early Middle Ages, at least in smaller, more isolated communities. But there is little evidence to demonstrate this, and almost no evidence beyond the 6th century AD. Ultimately, it is easy for tiny, isolated communities to slip through our records. For instance, we have very little evidence of the survival of Crimean Gothic until one 16th century source for the language having survived in the region unattested for over a millennium. And if we lacked this one 16th century record, it is unlikely that linguists would take the survival of Gothic into the early modern period seriously. Likewise, any of these Celtic-speaking communities could have small, isolated remnants remaining long after our attestations, hidden somewhere in the Anatolian mountains, the Carpathians, the Swiss or the Slovene Alps, or the Central Massif in France, or any other possible locations for late Celtic refugia. While our best evidence might come from Gaul and Galatia, this may be the result of better sources from these regions rather than longer survival. So now that you've listened through all of this, where do you think the best candidate is? Do you think it's Gaul? Do you think it's Anatolia? Or is there a different candidate I should have included? Is there anywhere you think I've missed? Please give me your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and please do make any corrections that you can think of. This is a long video, it's taken a lot of research, and I've almost certainly missed something. So if you spot that, please do point it out, and I'll reference it in a pinned comment.